You'd be forgiven for looking at the Route 66 State Park as just another quiet plot of land in eastern Missouri. Located off of Exit 265 on Interstate 44, the park's 419 acres provide plenty of trails for hiking, cycling, and even fishing on the Merrimack River. The park's visitor center, a former roadhouse, is filled with plenty of vintage Route 66 memorabilia, showcasing the former beauty of the buildings and towns that once graced the roadways of the state from the 1930s to the 1960s. On the surface, all seems fairly straightforward, but tucked away in that simple visitor center's museum is a small plaque, vaguely commemorating one of America's greatest triumphs over environmental disaster in a place called Times Beach. Yet, strangely, this supposed town is nowhere to be found in the surrounding 419 acres, because Times Beach is a ghost town. And to know the story, you must first turn the clock back almost 100 years. The town of Times Beach was founded in 1925 by, of all things, a newspaper, the St. Louis Star-Times. The publication owned a large plot of land along the Merrimack River and decided to sell lots meant for summer homes packaged with a 6-month subscription of the paper for the low price of $67.50. This bargain was an attempt at creating a resort town near St. Louis meant for high society, and was perhaps seen as a financial wager to ensure the St. Louis Star-Times' economic survival into the coming decades. For a while, things worked, but a combination of factors, including the socioeconomic state of Missouri after the Great Depression, and the fact that the town was built on a floodplain, spelled an almost certain end to the high hopes of the town's founders. By June of 1951, the Star-Times went out of print, and the dream of Times Beach began to fade, so that by 1970, the town had morphed into a suburb of mostly low-income housing, with a population of only about 1,200. To call the town poor was an understatement. Unable to secure enough funding for infrastructure, its 23 miles of roads and streets went unpaved, resulting in constant and unbearable dust during summer months. In order to combat it, various neighbors hired a man from Ellisville named Russell Bliss to spray a layer of oil onto the dirt roads. Bliss ran a company that disposed of waste oil, and as a side gig, he would occasionally spray this material to treat unpaved streets. This crude method kept the dust from rising and was an affordable solution for an annoying problem. Bliss gladly agreed to treat various dust-filled neighborhoods for a small fee. By 1972, he had become so widely used by the town's residents that the city officially contracted with him to spray at will throughout the entire town for the next 2 years. But unbeknownst to the residents of Times Beach, a terrible truth lay behind Bliss's oil, a tale of shady bureaucracy and dangerous government dealings. 3.5 hours away from Times Beach sat the town of Verona, Missouri, and in it a chemical facility owned by the company Hoffman Taff. Hoffman Taff was, among other things, contracted by the United States military to produce the chemical 2,4,5-T, a pesticide, which, when combined with pesticide 2,4-D, produced the chemical we refer to today as Agent Orange, used during the Vietnam War. The production of Agent Orange creates an excess waste stream filled with a highly toxic carcinogen called dioxin. Hoffman Taff's facility contained this waste in a still residue tank, which they kept on site. By the time the U.S. military ended their use of Agent Orange, Hoffman Taff was left with this dioxin-laden holding tank and began looking for new business. Unable to find much work, eventually the company began leasing part of their facility as a way to make extra money. They contracted with a company on the east coast of the United States called the Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company Incorporated, or NPACO. NPACO produced the compound hexachlorophene, which at that time was used widely as a disinfectant in antibacterial hand soaps, toothpaste, and other topical products. Today, we know that hexachlorophene is toxic, but during the 1970s, NPACO produced it at the facility around the clock. Manufacturing hexachlorophene also produces dioxin, and so NPACO piped this waste into the still residue tank already in use by Hoffman Taff. The tank could only hold so much, and soon the facility needed to empty its contents to free up space. But how to get rid of this toxic material? The most effective way was incineration, but that was costly. Napaco began looking for less expensive options and was soon approached by the Independent Petrochemical Corporation, or IPC, who offered to transfer the waste off-site and dispose of it for a fraction of the price. Napaco quickly agreed, and the company was contracted. From here, things get very, very murky. Napaco agreed to pay IPC 25 cents for every gallon of dioxin taken off the facility, or about $3,000 per load. However, rather than transfer the material directly, IPC decided to subcontract the work. While Napaco paid IPC in return paid a local waste disposal company close to the facility to cut their own costs. In short, Napaco hired the lowest bidder, who in return hired their own lowest bidder. That subcontractor was Russell Bliss. While Napaco agreed to pay IPC 25 cents a gallon, IPC offered to pay Russell Bliss a nickel. In total, IPC would be paid $3,000 per load. They would then pay Russell Bliss $125 of that to do the actual work. There are varying accounts of the agreement between IPC and Russell Bliss, but they all center around this main question. Did IPC tell Mr. Bliss what he would be hauling? Bliss maintains that IPC simply told him the barrels contained waste oil, which was, after all, the purpose of his company.
It never entered my mind what they were doing or what they were making. I was told at one time they were making ladies' face cleanser. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I know one time some of the workers down there said, "What do you do with this old oil?" And I said, "Well, I spray it in horse arenas and sell it for re-refined oil, and they make heavy industrial fuel out of it, and spray it on country roads," and nobody said nothing.
IPC claims that Russell Bliss agreed to take the barrels to an atomic waste site in Rolla, Missouri for proper disposal. For whatever difference it makes, no such atomic waste site exists. Regardless of who knew what and when, eventually Russell Bliss came into the possession of the dioxin-filled waste containers. Opening one up, Bliss decided the waste could be used as a supplement to his own oil supply, so he mixed them. In addition to the waste oil company, Bliss owned a farm and horse arena plagued by dust. One day, Bliss decided to spray some of his oil on the ground to control the problem. Several visitors on Bliss's property were impressed at how well the technique worked, and eventually he was asked by various customers to spray the oil on their property to control their own dust issues, including several horse arenas, one in Moscow Mills, and eventually on the dirt roads of a struggling town called Times Beach. Due to their frequent use, the town's roads needed to be sprayed every few weeks. By the end of 1973, Russell Bliss is estimated to have sprayed more than 100,000 gallons of his oil. It didn't take very long for signs that something was terribly, terribly amiss. Within a few days of Bliss's work at the arena in Moscow Mills, birds began to drop dead from the rafters, and the horses developed sores and lost their hair. The owners of the arena began exhibiting signs of illness too: headaches, nosebleeds, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. At another stable Bliss treated near Jefferson City, 12 horses dropped dead, and several children developed chloracne, a skin condition associated with dioxin poisoning. A third arena near St. Louis also experienced evidence of poison soon after hiring Bliss to spray. Almost immediately, these events attracted the eyes of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and an investigation was launched. Little was known about the effects of many carcinogens during this time, so it took almost 4 years of investigation and tests on soil found in the stables to confirm a dioxin contamination, and all the while Russell Bliss sprayed the streets of Times Beach. During this time, many residents experienced cases of hives, lip and face swelling, and other unexplained general sicknesses. In 1972, the FDA issued a ban on hexachlorophene manufacturing after 32 infants in France died when exposed to high levels of the substance through household baby powder. As a result, Napaco went out of business that year. 2 years pass, and in 1974, the CDC, busy tracking down the source of the mysterious dioxin contamination, confronted Russell Bliss. Bliss denied any knowledge of the existence of dioxin contamination in his oil, and in fact denied any knowledge on the substance of dioxin altogether.
I wouldn't have known what it was if they had told me what it was. If you want the truth, you could tell me it was some kind of a new jelly and I'd put it on toast and eat it. 'Cause I didn't know what dioxin was and still don't know exactly what it is.
In return, the CDC produced a list of possible production sites for the toxin. On that list, Napaco. The chemical facility in Verona, by this time operated solely by Syntex Agribusiness, formerly Hoffman Taff, was soon inspected. There, the CDC found a tank filled with 4,300 gallons of toxic waste containing a concentration of dioxin left over from Napaco's time at the facility. Syntex had no incinerator to dispose of the waste, and so kept it on site, planning to get rid of it sometime in the next 5 years. Soil samples around Verona revealed a small concentration of dioxin too, and the EPA was slowly brought in. By 1975, a confidential report from the CDC to the EPA advised the removal and burial of contaminated soil. However, later in that report, the CDC stated that the half-life of dioxin was 1 year, and based upon that estimate, Missouri officials determined a cleanup would be too costly and ultimately unnecessary. We know today that this estimate is false. The half-life of dioxin is now believed to be anywhere from 7 to 11 years. The EPA report triggered 4 more years of backdoor bureaucracy, testing, and investigation, until 1979, when a former Napaco employee finally tipped officials off to the burial of toxic waste on a farm near Verona. At this point, the EPA turned their full attention to the situation, and during their investigation of the farm, unearthed 90 barrels of waste, all of which were heavily corroded and leaking into the soil. 11 of the barrels tested positive for dioxin concentrations as high as 2,000 parts per million, which is above hazardous levels to humans. The EPA's worst fears were confirmed. Napaco had been dumping toxic waste at this Verona farm site, and, as they soon discovered, into the nearby Spring River, where preliminary tests showed dioxin at 62 parts per billion. A quarter mile from the chemical plant, a dairy farmer's cows who drank from the river began dying and losing calves. To this day, rumors still persist of hundreds of toxic barrels still buried deep underground near Verona. In June of 1982, the EPA revisited the infected horse arenas and took new soil samples. To their horror, the levels of dioxin hadn't decreased since the initial tests years earlier. Though a decade had passed since the stables had been sprayed, they were still hazardous. Realizing their misunderstanding of the effects and the extent of dioxin contamination, the EPA collected and tested several hundred more soil samples, urging all of the locations to close permanently. Later that year, documents from the EPA leaked to the public revealed 14 confirmed and over 40 possibly contaminated sites in the state of Missouri. One of them was Times Beach. At the release of this report, residents were shocked to learn that for over a decade, they had been living on poisoned soil. That November, the EPA finally arrived at Times Beach and took samples. Residents were understandably uneasy about the presence of men in hazmat suits canvassing the small town, and as December approached, it brought rain. Rain in Times Beach means flooding, and the EPA raced against the clock to gather samples before the rising tide would wash their progress away. The day after the agency completed its sampling, Times Beach suffered the worst flood in its history. The entire town was evacuated. 2 days before Christmas, the waters finally began to recede, and the EPA's test results came in. Dioxin. Concentrations on the town's roadways were as high as 100 parts per billion. Dioxin is hazardous at 1 part per billion. The EPA recommended that Times Beach be abandoned. Due to the constant risk of flooding and the possible spread of contamination, it was further recommended that the entire town and its soil be incinerated, and the government set up barricades to block people from re-entering the town. Its residents, now displaced, vented their frustration at government officials. Many in Times Beach, suffering ill effects of the dioxin, demanded to know why the EPA, which had known about the contamination for over 10 years, had failed to inform them.
I'll tell you what, if you want people to be assured, first of all, you better find out who is exposed, how much they're exposed, and get your show together before you start doing a study.
Before long, lawsuits were filed between various parties, and caught in the middle was Russell Bliss. Seen as the Grim Reaper by many of the townspeople, Bliss endured constant attacks and harassment, all while maintaining his innocence.
I swear to all of you, I had no idea this material was bad.
The national news media coverage added more fuel to the fire as blame was passed around from one governmental department to another. What was to be done for the people of Times Beach, who now found themselves homeless, many without a dime to their name? Estranged residents of the town demanded a buyout from the federal government, threatening to hit the EPA, CDC, and others with lawsuit after lawsuit. After repeated public outcry, then-President Ronald Reagan created the Times Beach Dioxin Task Force on January 7, 1983, which consisted of representatives from the EPA, CDC, FEMA, and the Army Corps of Engineers. A month of non-stop media coverage later, the federal government announced that they would pay $33 million to buy every single residential property and business in the town. By 1985, the residents of the town had fully relocated, and Missouri Governor John Ashcroft issued an executive order to disincorporate the town. For 10 more years, the town was gated off and patrolled around the clock by government officials to keep people out. During this time, the entire town was bulldozed and placed into a massive landfill, erasing every square inch of Times Beach from the map. By 1995, the EPA installed an incinerator on the site, and the government finally began to destroy the dioxin-laden materials. The massive cleanup project was completed in 1997 and in total cost close to $200 million. In 1999, the area was finally reopened to the public as a state park. The only hint of the town that once stood there on a small plaque tucked away in the park's visitor center. To this day, plenty of questions still go unanswered. Mainly, who's to blame? The chemical companies certainly share some blame for their poor handling of toxic materials, and yet, at the time, there were no regulations in place for how such materials were to be handled. The government certainly could have put safeguards in place, but research and understanding of the harmful effects of dioxin at that time was limited, and to be fair, you don't usually regulate things that you don't know will kill you. Then there's the IPC. Their questionable subcontracting practices were negligent at best, and criminal at worst. And, of course, there's Russell Bliss. His decision to mix the toxic material into his oil led to the destruction of an entire town and the poison of both humans and animals. Whether intentional or not, many to this day still lay the blame at his feet. Others are more sympathetic, feeling that Bliss oil was used as a scapegoat by all of the chemical companies involved to take the heat for the toxic material that they chose not to properly dispose of. In 1993, a lawsuit between Times Beach residents, Syntex, Napaco, IPC, and others was settled. 2,140 residents received anywhere from $2,000 to $90,000. Russell Bliss was never found guilty of any criminal behavior. In the summer of 2012, the EPA revisited Route 66 State Park to test the soil again. Later that November, they reported that, quote, soil samples from Route 66 State Park show no significant health risks for park visitors or workers. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming service that offers over 2,000 documentaries and nonfiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. If true stories like Times Beach are up your alley, you'll love their selection, covering science, nature, history, technology, and more. Unlimited access starts at just $2.99 a month, but you can get your first 30 days for free if you sign up at curiositystream.com/AustinMcConnell and use the promo code AustinMcConnell during the sign-up process. CuriosityStream is available worldwide on platforms like Roku, smart TVs, Amazon Kindle, and inside your own web browser. A streaming service dedicated to learning, exploration, and understanding. Available now.